Hello and welcome back to my lair. I am joined this time with Mango, and I am once again your host, the Rambling Lich. And today we are talking about the undead in general. This is kind of just going to be an overview of what the undead are, how there is never really a good reason to make undead. At least, there is no morally justifiable reason to make an undead. There are practical reasons. There are very practical reasons. For instance, a undead worker is much, much cheaper than its construct counterpart. Creating a construct requires a lot of backline logistics, resources, and everything industry-wise to put that together. Whereas the creation of undead requires some rituals and a corpse. And if you're just creating, something to hoe a field, well, a skeleton is going to be able to do that job fairly easily. But let's talk about the various breakdowns of the undead first. Undead on Glorian can generally be broken down into 4 categories. The mindless undead, the hungry undead, the incorporeal undead, and the consummate undead. The mindless undead are essentially drones. They will do either what they're told whenever they are created, or if they are naturally occurring in places where void energy is thick and there are lots of corpses, they will do little more than hunt whatever the nearest living creature is, or wherever the nearest living creature they saw was. Nothing is funnier than going through an ancient battlefield, seeing a couple of zombies that are just still trying to dig at where the nearest mole that they saw on the ground was. Some of them can get quite deep after a couple hundred years. The hungry undead, meanwhile, are often at least marginally intelligent. They can plan. They might even have something outside of just feeding their hunger if they are more disciplined. But generally, they are going to be forced through whatever supernatural curse creates them into satisfying whatever it is their base needs are. Some of their base needs are literally just murder. Sometimes it's feeding. Regardless, they are compelled in some way, shape, or form. The incorporeal undead are essentially ghosts. They can take various forms, various types of ghosts, but regardless, these are creatures that are, for whatever reason, without a physical body. Often these are the most likely to be created by accident. And the consummate undead are those who essentially have chosen undeath in some way, shape, or form. They, for the most part, maintain their personalities they had in life, goals, intention, and whatever else motivated them. This is going to be your vampires, liches, mummies, so on and so forth. Often they will still have some form of undead curse, i.e. the duty to guard a certain area, a hunger for blood, or a general manic obsession with the collection of knowledge and forbidden lore. But that is more often overlaid with who they originally are. And that's kind of going to be your 4 major categories of undead. And as we go through a few examples, we will kind of say where we feel each form falls into. Is there anything you would like to add here?
Undeath is widely seen as a grave crime because it perverts the once living soul and body. Most people don't have a high tolerance for any form of undead creature.
So how do we get to undead? One of the most common is that they are created. The ritual for creating undead can be performed at various ranks, costs a varying amount of gold, and often create very different types of undead, obviously. Depending on what you're trying to do, this will more often than not give you control over the undead that you create. However, if you fail and you create an undead, then you probably won't have control over that, and it will likely immediately try to attack you. That is one of the risks that you take up whenever you perform this kind of action. You will pretty much always require a corpse when trying to create undead. You will pretty much always require several less than savory reagents, various poisons, various reactants. Sometimes crystals are needed, obsidian being a very common one. Most undead created intentionally will serve a purpose. Either you have a necromancer who has decided that they are going to fill their castle, their lair with undead skeletons that serve them, or they have a particular dislike of a particular clergyman, and so they create a couple of ghouls to go and, well, do ghoul things. It's the type of person creating undead is rarely one who is nice. There is a certain tolerance for the unsavory that you need. Moving on from the create undead ritual itself, we will talk about various undead creatures specifically, and these will be in batches of what you're likely to encounter in order if you were to go up an undead hierarchy. Note, this is not including any of the necromancers who might be raising these undead. They kind of stand to the side of all of that, in my opinion. But just note that, especially for several of the lower ranking undead, there's probably a guy in a black robe sitting in a graveyard somewhere just digging up corpses every now and then to create a new one. And the first on our list is a corpse light, a will-o-wisp, or at least an undead will-o-wisp. It is a creature that will attempt to either trick you into following it into bogs, places where you can get bogged down and will die naturally, or if it is more malevolent, it can possess various corpses around it, either medium or small creatures that haven't been claimed by another corpse light in the last 24 hours. And it can possess such a creature to attack whatever might be threatening it or not following it. Take a corpse light who has, for however many years, led travelers astray into a bog, who will then possess the body of a fairly recently lost villager, as the group of adventurers were sent to go and find this person. The corpse light who has possessed said body just keeps beckoning them deeper and deeper into the swamp until suddenly they end up surrounded by various other corpse lights, either merged or unmerged, all being led onto what essentially amounts to a one-way trip. And that is one of the weaker forms of the incorporeal undead. One of the two most common forms of undeath you will find are zombies. Generally, zombies are going to be weak against slashing, they're going to be slow, and they're going to be tough. Because essentially, a zombie is nothing more than a corpse reanimated by dark magic to perform a task. They rarely perform said task quickly, but they are very persistent. You can add modifiers onto your zombies whenever you create them to make them more disease-ridden, enhance that good old zombie rotting stink so that maybe whatever is fighting them is vomiting in their helmet just a little bit. But a zombie is a zombie. If they make up the bulk of your undead legions, they make it up specifically because they are persistent and very difficult to kill quickly. They feel no pain, which is a very common factor amongst the undead, and they just keep going until they are destroyed. Zombies are also one of the most common to naturally rise in places of great void energy and death. Moving on to skeletons. Would you like to tell us about the skeletons, Mango?
Held together by magic and moved by the evil energy that powers their existence, skeletons are another form of mindless undead that you'll find relatively commonly. Depending on who you ask, a skeleton might be seen as nothing more than a zombie without its flesh on. Held together by magic and motivated by the evil energies that power its existence, a skeleton is another form of mindless undead that you will commonly find in the lands. Trading out its slashing weakness for bludgeoning weaknesses, the skeleton can be formed of any creature that once had bones in its body. More nimble than a zombie, the skeleton can, in most cases, work a little quicker. More nimble than the average zombie, the skeleton can work a little quicker, and, like the zombie, can have a multitude of innate abilities depending on either the creator's will or, sometimes, the environment in which the creator finds the skeleton to raise. For example, if an explorer went missing in a cave and their corpse was overgrown with brambles, or if, for example, they found themselves near a lava flow underground, they may be raised as a thorny corpse, a skeleton of roses, if you will, or a blazing skeleton, in which case the skeleton itself is covered in fire. Necromancers may be able to mix and match these abilities as they wish, because realistically, the skeletons have very little sense of identity. If a bone is broken or misplaced during combat, the skeleton can find another bone of similar size or shape and simply replace it, eventually, possibly, making itself into a little ship of Theseus, eventually replacing every bone in its body because they simply don't care. A bone is a bone.
Skeletons can also make up some of the higher ranks of an undead army, especially if given more intelligence. They can just kind of get farther than most zombies will ever get.
The next undead could be considered hungry or consummate, depending on what lens you look at its rising through. Revenants are creatures motivated and raised by their one desire to get revenge against those who have killed them. The Revenant possesses the ability at all times to know the direction of their murderer, although not the distance, and is singularly motivated in hunting down and exacting their revenge upon the person who killed them. Even if the killer was not exactly a willing participant in the death, it may have arisen from an accident, the Revenant does not care and will not forgive. The only thing the Revenant knows is vengeance.
It's important to remember that the Revenant will have all the information, and unless they were serving under certain gods who take a very particular stance against undeath, will likely have all the abilities that they had whenever they were alive. So a Revenant who was a fighter, who has woken up because, again, they were murdered, maybe even by a supposedly friendly rogue, will have all of their training at their disposal. At the same time, a Revenant who was a spellcaster, wizard, bard, whatever, you're all looking at the same thing, where now they have all the properties of an undead, that is solely focused on the destruction of their murderer. The only thing that is very difficult to get around is everything the Revenant does is in service to finding their murderer and killing them. And you can't really talk your way out of it because they sense you. They know you are the one that killed them.
It is worth noting, however, that if you're not the murderer, relatively speaking, you don't have much to fear from the Revenant. They don't harbor undue ill will towards the living like most other undead do. The only thing they want is revenge. If their murderer dies, they cease to be.
Revenants are one of few undead motivated by their own destruction, or rather motivated to their own destruction. Moving on to another undead that is one of the most likely to be created by accident, the Ghost. The Ghost is an incorporeal undead that, like I said, is probably the most likely to be created by accident. Dying under strange circumstances, dying with unfinished business, in some cases, not even understanding that they are dead. Ghosts are the cause for most hauntings in a area. They can be dispelled by means other than violence more often than not, and usually don't understand what they are doing. Ghosts are often trapped in a moment very similar or representative to the age they lived in, when the age they lived in could have been hundreds of years ago. They fly, they can be invisible, they have many traits that terrify the common folk and will often cause common folk to search for help dealing with them. But more often than not, a ghost is as much a victim of its circumstances as anything else. Of course, the constant influx of void energy that is inherent to most undead, most if not all undead, will over time cause it to become much more agitated and cause more aggressive behaviors, which is what leads to the ghost house on the end of the street never being able to be occupied for more than a couple of months at a time regularly. However, some ghosts, very, very few, can have more higher levels of functioning, all the way up to even the king of Geb, also named Geb, being a ghost king of the most prominent undead nation on Glorian. Just because many ghosts are in some way confused or in some way agitated, that doesn't mean all of them are. And there are no two ghosts that are going to be the same. The thing that one ghost might want that can put it to rest might be completely different to a different ghost. There's a reason there are groups who have made their entire living on just putting the unquiet dead to rest. Mango, would you like to talk to us about ghouls?
One of the more prominent members of the hungry undead, ghouls are characterized by their desire to eat corpses. Found mostly in graveyards or in warrens underneath them, ghouls are singularly motivated by their desire to consume. A desire they are happy to share with you if they happen to get their hands on you. Capable of burrowing underground and leaping at half their movement speed, ghouls are quite adept at ambushing players and immobilizing them for their nefarious purposes. Sometimes, ghouls can be found living in a ghoulish society, though by human standards it might be considered unsavory, repugnant even, and it'll generally be centered around the consumption of flesh of corpses and other acts of less favorable morals.
One thing to note, because ghouls are intelligent, an adventuring party who has come across a warren filled with ghouls who find a way to communicate in a non-hostile manner might be able to convince said ghouls to pay for any disposal said party might be interested in. Because after all, if the ghouls know that you are going to be regularly dropping off their favorite McDonald's snack, they are going to be less likely to attack you in the same way that you don't attack your delivery driver. They are intelligent creatures, and you can interact with them in such a way. If they attack you in a group and manage to kill one of your party members, they might try to make a deal that if you just let them take the party member that they killed, they will leave the rest of you alone. That is a deal that they might bring up. They might be willing to make that negotiation. Obviously, you might not, but that wouldn't stop them from trying.
If you happen to find yourself in one of the ghoul societies and you're not under attack, you may find that ghouls can be slightly more useful than expected. Once an hour, a ghoul can call upon the knowledge from any creature it's eaten within the last 7 days. If the creature was trained in a skill, it can use the skill of that person's discipline as if it were trained. Or, in some cases, they may have valuable information because they can automatically learn any specific knowledge known by any creature that it has consumed within the last 7 days, such as a hidden treasure or the name of a loved one.
And obviously, a ghoul would be considered one of the hungry undead. Moving into another member of the incorporeal, we can talk about the banshee, a much more terrifying version of a ghost. Often these were often elven women in life who have perished in some form or another in tragedy. They always can hear the heartbeat of living creatures within 60 feet of it in an imprecise sense. They have a weakness to sunlight and are one of the more difficult incorporeal undead to deal with because they view everything from the lens of their final moments. And that can be the touch of whoever it was that killed them in betrayal. It could be the loneliness of whatever decided to drive them to whatever decisions they may have made. They are creatures born from tragedy who are stuck writhing in that tragedy. A lover betraying them, a brother deciding to try and cut them out of the will quite literally. And all of this accumulates in the Banshee's most feared ability, the Wail. The Banshee's Wail is its most feared ability, a high DC effect that if you fail, you take a massive amount of void damage and drain damage, and critically failing doubles all of this. It is one of the reasons why the Banshee is one of the most difficult to deal with incorporeal undead. Moving into the vampire then.
One of the most quintessential consummate undead, known and feared by many across the lands, this seemingly ubiquitous undead feeds on the blood of the living around them. Known for odd compulsions like the inability to cross running water or the inability to enter a private dwelling, repulsed by common items like garlic or religious symbols. The vampire is one of the more dangerous undead that the average person can encounter. With the ability to grapple a victim with its claw attacks and drain the blood from its body, the vampire will both sustain its life and heal itself in combat. and that's just the common vampire servitor. The more powerful vampires, true vampires if you will, have the ability to create vampire servitors and the ability to avoid most certain death by triggering a missed escape skill that'll allow them at 0 HP to return to their coffin without any regard for possible dangers on the way. Vampires are one of the harder undead to destroy because when they reach 0 HP, they are not destroyed. Instead, they fall into a state of torpor, and their body, if put into their coffin for an hour, will regenerate HP and they will start to recover as normal. The only sure way to put down a vampire is to remove its head and anoint it with holy water.
Note, due to the nature of vampires' feeding habits, you are rarely going to see a vampire living on its own. It will have often infiltrated, if not installed itself, within a village or other well-inhabited area. It could be the local doctor who actually takes care of most of the villagers and occasionally will drink from either the healthy who could stand to lose a pint or two, or those the vampire knows can't make it and simply takes the last little bit. It could also be the ruler of said village or city who has several laws that create incidentally a large amount of criminals who then get taken to the dungeon and become part of the vampire's food stock. Vampires are one of them that keep a fair amount of their personality from when they were alive, so they can come in all shapes and forms, some more reasonable than others.
True vampires have the ability to change shape into animal forms, such as bats, wolves, or, in some cases, unexpected forms. It is worth noting that some vampires can retain positive emotions after their transformation, but it seems to always come at the cost of their vampiric powers being diminished as a result. So it is not unlikely to find a vampire who has eventually slid from the path of a noble person into a less savory way of life.
Move on to the last of the undead we're going to mention, the Lich. The undead spellcaster, often arcane, is what happens when your spellcaster has decided that it will not die. There is a purpose that it needs to continue doing at practically any cost. The creation of the Lich is one of, if not the most selfish thing a single character can do for itself. They are immortal, protected by a phylactery, created via some of the darkest magic rituals that mortals can come across. A Lich, generally speaking, will have access to whatever magics it had in life, as well as whatever magics it has learned in its undeath, and can have been around for a very, very long time. Many of the oldest Liches have been around for thousands of years, often just in whatever tower, dungeon, crypt they have created around themselves, occasionally leaving or orchestrating something to be fed into their phylactery to maintain their own life. More often than not, after a various amount of time, a Lich will have a very tenuous grasp on anything resembling sanity, because whatever drove them into that decision will often long be forgotten as they dive deeper and deeper into whatever obsession decided that they alone must live forever and deal with whatever it is that they decided. needed dealing with, and that's if the Lich started out good. A Lich that was evil from the start, that knew everything that it was getting itself into, that wanted nothing but power and dominance. Well, they normally don't last that long to begin with, because they're the most likely to leave their lairs and cause unnecessary trouble. But if they do leave their lair, they do cause that unnecessary trouble. They are one of the most difficult things to put down for good, because of the phylactery. A Lich that is killed, but its phylactery is not destroyed, will simply reform around their phylactery. Their phylactery must be destroyed in order to put the Lich down for good. Destroying a Lich's phylactery does not destroy the Lich. If you destroy the phylactery, you still have to go out, find, and destroy the Lich. And a Lich has had a long time to think about how to protect that phylactery. The base spells and enchantments around the phylactery prevent that phylactery from being magically located. That is the baseline. The room in which the phylactery is in is probably trapped to all hell, because that phylactery contains whatever remains of the Lich's soul.
I hate to be stuck in a lair with one of them for all time.
Things to note about the undead in general. The undead are one of the more difficult creature types, categories to deal with, because even the weaker creations of undeath come with a stack of immunities. Immunity to unconsciousness, immunity to poison, immunity to paralyzation, immunity to disease, immunity to death effects, immunity to bleeding. These are all tools that lower rank parties might have been relying on to deal with various creatures. If you are not studying the thing that you are trying to get rid of, then you are almost certainly going to be unprepared for dealing with them. Figuring out what the particular undead that you're dealing with is weak to is the first step to making it out of that encounter alive. For instance, the corpse light, the vampire, and the banshee all have a weakness to sunlight, where it will make it powerless, it will make it clumsy, and some of their abilities will simply not function. A revenant doesn't care if it is in sunlight. However, a revenant is also single-mindedly focused on whatever its task is. If you come across a revenant and you are not its target, you can simply help it along and it will leave you alone. It doesn't need to eat. It doesn't need to kill. The only thing it needs is to get revenge on its own murderer, and therefore it can be sidestepped. You don't necessarily have to interact with it beyond that. Ghouls, depending on your circumstance, can be reasoned with. Same with vampires. Often your best bet with the undead, if you are not specifically hunting them, is to avoid or reason with the higher level undead. Or if there is a necromancer involved who cannot be reasoned with, kill the source creating them. Mindless undead, not given directions, will be much easier to deal with than a directed army of undead. Oh, and take note that undead are healed by void energy and harmed by vitality energy, opposite to what living creatures are healed and harmed by.
With such a variety of forms and abilities, the threats a party faces from the undead are only limited by the imagination of those who create them.
And with all that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Goodbye.
Depending on who you ask, a skeleton might be seen as a zombie without the flesh